Welcome. Wow. Can you hear me? I think so. We're so happy to see all of you here tonight. This is our second annual Cancer Tribute, and we just take such pleasure in bringing wonderful people who are interested in Madeline Island history of every sort to this museum. I also want to welcome our live stream audience, which is a first for us. And I'd like to introduce myself. I am Linda Mack, and I'm the president of the Friends of the Madeline Island Museum, which is a fledgling organization. We were really founded about 3 years ago, and we want to be a supporter and promoter of this wonderful museum and a community voice with the Wisconsin Historical Society, which operates the museum. And so we have grown. We have 100 some members, and we're glad that you're all here tonight. We are doing this event. It's called the Cancer Tribute. Why do we call it the Cancer Tribute? We are honoring the legacy of Bella and Leo Cancer, who founded this museum in 1958. They donated it to the Wisconsin Historical Society in 1968. And they are the ones who collected all of those wonderful objects in the old museum, which I hope you have had a chance to go through and enjoy. And we really feel it's important to honor their legacy and to kind of keep their memories alive. And so we started the Capser Tribute, and this is the second annual Capser Tribute. So I think that is all I have to do for my introduction. Just checking my post-it. But my next job is to introduce Paul DeMaine, who is a member of our board. He is an activist and advocate for all sorts of good causes. He brings people together, he brings cultures together. We're very proud to have him as a board member, and he has been a moving force to bring this evening together. So Paul will introduce our speaker, Anton Treuer.
A couple days ago, we had another prominent speaker and intellectual from the Anishinaabe community make a presentation, McGeezy or Mike Sullivan. And I was interested in his presentation because he started with certain information and kind of built a picture of what was going around that concept. In a lot of ways, that's how the Ojibwe language works. It takes something and builds upon it, describes it, and gives its animacy and color and other creative things. And it's an interesting way because I sometimes tell people, listen to these lessons in the language, pay attention to them to see where they go. And, you know, I've been a student of learning the language for a long time. But many years ago when I was in the lodge working under the title Gaa-pi-izhiwebak rather than the name Gaa-pi-izhiwebak, because an old man named Pipe Mustache said, we gave you an Indian name, that's a good Indian name, but it's a title in the lodge, and today we get a society, and we did it. So you can never get away from it. So he tied me into that, and that's kind of the way my world has worked. Anton Treuer is someone that I have an admiring respect for because he never gave up with what he had in mind. I remember outside of the medicine lodge, I had to convey a message from the elderly ladies, Okinakway in the lodge, and say, go talk to that young man. He came into a lodge with a pad and pencil and he was writing things down. So I sit him in the tent and say, Tony, the old lady says you're not supposed to do that anymore. And then I recessed over to my tent where I got my tablet out and wrote things down inside the tent. Someday we can compare some of those notes. I knew Tony when he was a small young man traveling with his father, Robert, and Peggy, both prominent people in the community who were interested in culture, language, and all those things. And Tony picked that up, and he has been well done in terms of everything that he's done in terms of revival of the language ever since he was a young man. So I really look up to him because there's only a handful of young people who have taken under this task of revitalizing the language, and nothing stopped. And so we're appreciative of that. We did a little bit of a work in honoring this afternoon for that. So I'm going to quit there because sometimes when someone pushes the button, I go for a long time. I do want to note a couple things. The Anishinaabe name is Wagush. Okay, that's a fox. Foxes are related to coyotes and other animals like that. You always want to watch out when you got anything that has some coyote DNA because just like the trickster road runner, we have coyotes and foxes like that. On the island now, he's the second fox on the island. We have Misko Wagush, Marty Curry, who does his thing. Those people who've been around the island for a few years, there was a third fox. I'll remember it. Okay. That fox ran around downtown here. It had mange. It had a little bit of fur on the tail, and it got shot by one of the local deputies 3 times. And the local chief of police says, I think we got him. And then the next day, that fox was So I want to leave you with that note, because there are things that he's going to say that some of us may pick up as hilarious. So keep your ears nice and open, because humor is part of the balance of our life. So, miigwech, Anton Treuer, Wagush, it's all yours.
that fox running away? Miigwech. Kawe maji taya niwi Ojibwe mbungi. Nawinda munugug miigwech uendaman apiji and enimiguan bajayan. Miinawaa wene dananaga de wendamung. Gaa-pi-izhiwebak mewija. Kia enendamawaa go Anishinaabe. Izhichigewin, miinawaa jinanaga de wendamung dawaj ke Izhichigewin nigana kia. Wene apitain dagwa yo Anishinaabe mo in Shkweyang, gedana kobijagan inanig, gajinanaga de wendamawaa de wego de gwen wa yamawaa go Anishinaabe nigan. Oginanaga de wendan gedekiminan, nibe, gedinwewin inan, gedizhichigewin inan. Nongum dash jinanaga de wendamang gedana kobijagan inanig nigan. Awego de gwenge ayamawad migo nasab in the name them. I'll use English today, but they did ask me to come and share with you for a while. They didn't say anything at all about using a foreign language like English. English really is the foreign language. Yeah. Mine is one of the indigenous languages of this space, and it's always so strange to me that mine's the one that has people thinking sounds weird, foreign, and exotic. A manifestation of all the colonization that all of us have been dealing with. Yes. Right? Colonization is taking one language, one culture, one religion, and using it to supplant the others. It's about erasure. And even our modern school systems, educational systems, historical societies, all these things are still bent largely toward that purpose and with that set of expectations, often with pretty disastrous results. I mean, honestly, if you think about it, colonization has also often used violence to orchestrate the erasures. But when you solve all your problems with violence, it makes a bunch of other problems. Now, why would we think that all the problems created by the colonial way of solving problems could be solved by the colonial way of solving problems? Of course they cannot. And I think indigenous people have more than just a vestigial remnant of some totally different ways of looking at the world and solving problems. So I was asked to share a little bit about that. I'll do some get to know you stuff through the course of tonight's talk, simply because nobody sees the world the way that it is. We all see the world the way that we are. And we're all different. Even any two native people are going to have different experiences based upon their ages, genders, sexual orientations, experiences, and so forth. There isn't even really such a thing as the Ojibwe culture. It's a collection of interrelated cultures. And of course, there are similarities and through lines to a lot of those things, but there's also a lot of internal variation, which can be very confusing for those on the outside. But it's also one of the great beauties to the native experience. By the way, the English-speaking world's not all the same, right? Like, what do white people think about abortion, good or bad? You know, like, it's not that simple, right? And we understand that, yeah, white folk are kind of diverse politically and in a lot of other ways too. It was like that with any group of humans. I do think, though, that all the colonization stuff has left all of us with some baggage. So among the things, I won't do a thorough unpacking of that because we're going to really spend more of our time talking about language, culture, history. But among the things that happen for Indigenous people is that if we didn't grow up with everything handed on a silver platter, language, culture, deep knowledge of self, and so forth, a lot of times people experience that kind of as shame. Even though we're right where we should be, having been through all the crap that we have been through. I think even, if you think about Abrahamic religious traditions, they have some similarities. Concept of divine judgment, when you die, there's a right way and a wrong way. And I think even our secular thinking is deeply impacted by this. So as a result, all of us who are impacted by those things, which is all of us, have issues with judgment. So it's hard to even talk about somebody different from us because we're so terrified about being judged ignorant, offending someone. We tippy-toe around on eggshells rather than lean into the important conversations that are necessary to actually make things better. So for starters, thank you for being brave and showing up and leaning in. In one of the books I wrote, I started with this, and this is kind of an Ojibwe cultural frame for thinking about this, that you are a complete, fully realized human being. You are a soul who has a body. We'll even say things, it's not like we have souls, it's like we are souls. We have bodies for a little while. We're not humans looking for a spiritual experience. We are spirits having a temporary human experience. You are the one your ancestors were praying for and waiting for through the generations. You've been given a unique set of gifts, and you yourself are a gift to the world. Makes it so much easier to start. The late, great Tom Stillday, he was from a community called Panema on the Red Lake Reservation in northwestern Minnesota. It's a really interesting place there. Among other things, no one has ever been baptized. 100% traditional Ojibwe religious belief and funeral practice. By the way, if you're just coming in late, we have open seats in the front and over here on the side, so by all means, come on in and make yourselves comfortable. Anin. And so it's really interesting, you know, people, among other things, bury their dead in the front yard and have spirit houses. You may have seen them at some of the grave sites around here too. And so stepping out the door to your house, it's like there's mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, generation upon generation, older than America. Boy, it makes it hard to sell the family farm and move to California. In many ways, that is the American experience. We celebrate our freedom so much, it includes the freedom to have a malleable identity. If the job's in California, move, go to California, follow your dream, become Californian. But one of the defining attributes of being indigenous is of the land. It has to do with connection to place. And it's prevalent for a lot of people. At the same time, half of our enrolled tribal citizenry lives off reservation. 70% of the self-identified Native population is off reservation. And even for those who move off reservation, the connection, the psychological connection, the emotional, the spiritual connection to place is still something that is important to many people. But it does mean that one of the fundamental parts of being indigenous is being challenged. And has been for a long time. It's pretty cool to have this image back here. Are you familiar with that? Have you at least read the placards and things like that? You know, among things that I've done, there was a big court case that the Lake Superior Ojibwe tribes in Wisconsin had initiated with regard to taxation on tribal lands, which it was proven never should have been taxed. And it's interesting, I think one of the more widely misunderstood dimensions of the entire treaty period, including by a lot of indigenous people. The Ojibwe understood that there were lands that they excluded other people from. Sometimes we even had wars with our neighbors. Draw a line. And we understood that there were some lands that we shared use with our neighbors, whether we were friends or sometimes even with people we were not so friendly with, that there was a shared use area right in on the border. So there were kind of these two main concepts of land and territory in the Ojibwe worldview, although the idea of owning something was entirely different. Fee, title, patent, and so forth. Those words were not in the Ojibwe vocabulary. Even the word debaindan, which is usually translated as to own something, literally means to relate to something or measure it in your mind. So it must have been a strange effort trying to communicate around treaty times. Even in Ojibwe, the word for truth, de-bwe, de means heart, we means sound. If I tell my brother, if something ever happens to you, I will raise your kids as my own, in de-bwe. All right, but if I go rent a car and pay for the extra insurance, and then crash the car, and then find out they have to go after my insurance first before the other policy kicks in because of all the fine print, that's the English-speaking world's definition of truth. You know? Very different. So when you're coming into something, very different. And these were impossible times for Native leaders. You got to imagine even other major empires in the world, Alexander the Great, the Mongol Empire, all kinds of violence and, acquisitions of territories and peoples. The vanquished still got to keep their titles, positions, lives, and lands. They were just absorbed into the new empire. Native people here were not offered to keep their titles, lands, positions, or access to resources. And it made America's dispossession of Native Americans the fastest dispossession of humans in the history of the world. That's pretty tough stuff. The Ojibwe told the Americans, we don't want to sell this land. We don't want to give it up. We have always lived here. We will agree to change the status of certain lands to shared use. We'll share it with the newcomers. Not because we really want to, but because we know we have to accommodate if we're going to live. And we will reserve other sections for our exclusive use reservations. This is why every treaty across Michigan, Wisconsin, and so forth all had these clauses that have usually been understood to mean like harvest or treaty rights, like hunting, fishing, gathering. What the Native people are really saying is, we are changing the status of these lands to shared use with the newcomers, but we are not extinguishing our rights to these lands, including our rights to live here, hunt here, fish here, gather wild rice here. When these guys were doing statement made by the Indians, they're petitioned in the Ojibwe language and sending it to Washington, D.C., they said, we only understood that you would be taking some parts of trees that grow above the ground. So calling that a land cession treaty, the natives sold the land, is not actually accurate. That is not how Native people understood them. And the legal standard is, how did the people understand it at the time it was signed? That's why they won that case. But that is they were only litigating lands taken through taxation instead of all of it. There's still a lot of big unanswered questions. And the ramifications could be quite significant when you think about all the other things. So in some ways, like you hear people talk about land back, and sometimes I'd probably freak some people out to hear that. Like, what does that mean? We all got to go back to Europe or something? Like, I don't see how we unravel this. That is not what it means. But what it means is it's a restorative justice framework. There's no way to undo all the horrible things that were done. We can't go backwards in time, but there's a way to go forward. So like at Leech Lake, where I'm from, there was an 11,000 acre parcel repatriation. That's a pretty big chunk of land. And ultimately, like the initial resistance, there were people saying things like, oh, when those Indians get that land, no one's ever going to pay taxes on that. It's like, actually, this was public land that no one in America has ever paid taxes on. Oh, I just hadn't thought through all the things. And then what about all the white guys who like to go hunting up here? You know, what about the health of the forest? The natives will be killing everything. Well, the US government has a number of different agencies, and there's a big difference between, you know, the national forests and national parks. National park like Yellowstone, they don't usually clear cut the whole thing, but the national forests, they do. And all the proceeds go to the US federal government. They were clear cutting our whole res and repeating it every 35 years. When Leech Lake took control of that, they said, moratorium on cutting. We need to preserve what's left of any old growth forests for our traditional harvesters of medicines. We need to preserve our maple groves for those who harvest maple. And the vitality of the forest and the resources available for everybody, native and non-native, have only improved. And as we see more things like that, I think the non-native folks are realizing, oh, it's not just about taking something away from me. It's about restoring something that we actually had agreed to and promised to native people from the very beginning. When we understand it that way and see how that practically unfolds, and I think it opens it up as a restorative justice measure. Well, Tom was a lot of fun. He was the first person named chaplain for the Minnesota State Senate who is not from one of the religious traditions that came from across the ocean, again with the colonization. So that was him opening up the Senate with his pipe, and he'd say, I'm praying for politicians. Boy, do they need it. And that was even before some of the things we've seen in more recent years around here. Prescient in many ways. We had him at our university for a graduation banquet speech, which I always fondly remember, because I'd been asking them to bring him in. I said, you know, he's got a PhD in the School of Life. He'll be able to have a relevant, relatable experience for our students. It'll be awesome. Finally, they relented, and I had to pull Tom to the side, and I was like, Tom, because he's so notoriously long-winded, I said, have you ever seen a TED Talk? They're like 15 minutes, okay? That's it, 15 minutes. Throw in a joke or two, focus on the students. We got a lot of awards to hand out. There's a lot of clapping tonight, you know, just play ball. And he's like, okay, got it. Got up there, he spoke for an hour and a half straight. It's like putting Paul Demain to shame. You know? And then he did it all in Ojibwe. And we were in mixed company, so I'm watching the deans and they're glazing over. He only said one thing in English. He said, hey, all you people who study Indians, study that. And he went and sat down. So I thought he was awesome. But he had good points. Most of the books written about Native people had been written by non-Native people who hadn't spent time in our places or talked to us. It wasn't just the history books. It was also like the substance abuse intervention plan with data sets that didn't include us. Then scratching their heads, like how come it's not working on this population the same way? Economic development plan, school turnaround plan. But boy, it makes a difference when you get some Native people developing the ideas and working on the implementation. I get to sit on the board for Wadukodading Ojibwe Language Institute, home of the first Ojibwe language immersion school in the United States. It's in the Hayward Lakes area, Lakudere. And it's so dang cool. I could spend the whole time just sharing with you some of the stuff going on over there. But they have done something that hasn't happened over there since World War II. They created fluent speakers out of little kids. And a bunch of little kids. And they've been going long enough now, 23 years, where they have graduates who've gone on and gotten college degrees, and one's sitting on the board with me over there, and you know, some of them are working as employees for the place. So something is happening. It doesn't fix everything everywhere all at once. It's an emerging effort. But it's a beautiful one. Cause for hope. I kind of feel honestly with our language that, you know, the future vitality of most languages on planet Earth is not certain. But for those that make a strong intervention, it's certainly possible. It depends on what we do and what we value. And there's a lot we could say, you know, I'll save it for the questions about why and how, and so forth. But to me, like, democracy is a new thing in the history of the world in relative terms. And this is the first time that we have had countries this large and this diverse trying to do democracy. And whether it's going to work or not is a question mark. But it will work not if we obliterate all of our neighbors and have everybody in one monoculture, but if we can have democracy support diversity. If we can have people who think differently, have different religions, believe differently, have different languages, but have a shared humanity and a shared nationality, it'll work. And so it's disconcerting that some people are fighting to undermine those essential needs of a democracy. And I'm stating those as like, I think that's a fact, not like I wish people would do that because that would be really nice. I think that's an essential requirement for it to succeed. For most of the lifetimes of most of the children in America today, there will not be a racial majority group. Everybody will have a minority experience of some kind. So protecting the rights of minorities is not, oh, those poor people. It's so the nation can work for all of us. Because if one can be trampled, we can all be trampled. This is some of the Jedi Council in Mille Lacs. I'll share one story about some of the work we did there. It was pretty cool. A couple years before the pandemic, I was brought to a meeting. Of course, I've been, I know there's some folks from Mille Lacs in here tonight, but I've been going to Mille Lacs for many years, mainly for ceremonies and things like that. And also doing a lot of language work. Did you bring those Oshkosh journals up here? Or they're sitting down there at the wigwam. If you are interested in some of Jim Clark's language stuff, Paul's got extra copies, which he is happy to share for free. But in any event, just a few years before the pandemic, they had done a language survey and identified 25 remaining fluent first speakers of the Ojibwe language in all of Mille Lacs. That's not a lot of people. They were all elders over 70. And, Mille Lacs has done some cool stuff. They're a successful gaming tribe. They saved half their money from gaming. Their endowment has eclipsed gaming as a revenue stream. They have a diversified business plan, put ceremonial dance halls in all of their communities. They've been trying to support language and culture and do different things. And they also, they'd brought me into this meeting. They said, we have some money. These are mainly overages from grants about workforce development. And we're at the point now where this money must be spent or it's going to go away. But we don't want to just train people how to work at Hardee's. We want to do something around our language and culture. And so I said, well, looking at all of the things that have been shared here, you're not going to send all of your elders back to college and get them degrees and have them work for another 30 years and, run a program like that. You're going to have to do something different. I said, also, there's so many things we need to make language and culture thrive. And so how about this? And I had a list of things. And I also asked them how much money you were talking about, and it was millions of dollars. And I said, how about this? Let's develop Rosetta Stone. Rosetta Stone, like Duolingo, Babbel, and other language learning tools, uses talking flashcards, audio, video, artificial intelligence, so it can correct grammar and speech as you interact with an app in real time. I said, how about a literacy initiative? Let's, record stories and things like that. Through all of this, you can do workforce development, teach people how to be a videographer, teach people how to be a transcriber, teach people our language, teach people curriculum development, all these different things. And they said, well, let's do all of it. And they did. Yeah. So first year of Rosetta Stone came out, and there were a lot of questions. If you want to get into the details, just feel free to ask. But they're big questions. Are we going to trust a non-native corporation to profiteer off of our colonization? Who's going to own the copyright? What if somebody wants recordings of their grandma? You know, all kinds of things. And so we arranged it so that Mille Lacs would retain the copyright, only paying Rosetta Stone for a service. Anything can be repurposed any which way they want. Mille Lacs would determine prices. They made it free for band members, nominal fees for everybody else in institutions. The first year dropped, includes a 500-page teacher guide. That's free. So even if someone's not a fluent speaker, they can do classroom implementation. Year 2 came out, another 500-page teacher guide. Year 3 should drop any day, and they'll keep going until they have a full 6-year development. It'll be the biggest development for any tribal language to date. And we got going on the books. Here's some of the books. We got 5 of them done so far. And oh man, then the pandemic hit. So then we had to send a grandchild and a computer to each elder's home. Teach them all how to do Zoom. Yeah, Carol, who's famous for many things, not just her knowledge, but her kindness. She's so supportive of everybody. I called her up. Sin, gadano kimen. Oh, tagijin giwanenda na jang busy kan bimisi kawaga na tagi wigamigong indija. She said, oh, I forgot about our work session. I got my coat on. I was going to the casino. I said, casino, there's a pandemic. You're supposed to stay home and stay safe. Well, the language is more important. Let's work. So she takes off her coat and sets up the computer, and we're working. And we work for a few hours, and then she goes, well, I'm going to the casino now. My niece has been waiting in a car the whole time. But that's how dedicated they were. It was just incredible. And oh man, you know, it was cool to see what they were willing to do and how productive they were. At the same time, like the pandemic, that was tough. Yeah, 6 of the 25 elders passed away. That's 20% of the fluent speakers in Mille Lacs. That's no joke. Joe Naquinabe, a revered spiritual leader and drum keeper here, his sister passed away from COVID. His brother got COVID, had heart complications, and passed. When we finally came out of the pandemic and all this stuff, and it was finally safe to convene people, we had a big celebration. And I was pretty floored, honestly. We asked Joe to speak, and he said, well, I thought he was just going to say this is just the toughest time. And he said, no, we've been through a lot. We've been through a lot the past few years, and we've been through a lot the past few hundred years. But I have to say that seeing all of these young people coming around, seeing what we've been able to build, knowing that our elders will be teaching people our language for hundreds of years to come, I have to say that this has been the happiest time of my life. Oh. And so one of the things I learned is that, of course, we're thinking about young people and trying to keep the language there for them, and there's healing for them in these things, but it's healing for our elders too. And by the way, it's not just like so we can hear all the pretty birds singing in the forest. The Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe can say working for the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe is a privilege. Everybody who takes that privilege can be expected to demonstrate this level of competency in the tribal language. Here's the tool to do it. Here are the assessments built right in. You have a year from date of hire. Welcome to the team. So it's sovereignty and lots of other things. And this too, an emerging effort. So there's a lot of cool stuff going on. There's home for me, epicenter of the universe right there. A couple folks in my family tree. I never had a way to talk about the John Smith. It's ironic he got the name John Smith. No connection to Pocahontas mythology. Are you familiar with Pocahontas mythology being mythology? That's getting to be more well known. Yeah. Maybe very briefly, for those who don't know, There was someone named Pocahontas. There was someone named John Smith. They never had a romantic relationship. That was all embellished. Pocahontas was taken as a prisoner, was held for ransom, was forced to marry a different Englishman named John Rolfe, had a son by him, brought to England, paraded before the Queen, dead by the age of 22.
MMIW.
And most of what I just explained, including her capture, ransom, forced marriage, and the birth of her child, all happened while she herself was a minor child. So dressing that up as romanticism, problematic, right? We should be dismantling the patriarchy and be opposed to, human trafficking and things like that, rather than calling it romance. But in any event, John Smith was born in the late 1700s. He passed away in 1922. He lived in parts of 3 centuries. He's not even the record holder for human longevity. It's also kind of incredible to me. But he was in our area when there were no white settlers, and he was still there when, all the soldiers came back from World War I. He never signed a treaty. He never sold anything. But he watched all that change during his lifetime. Next to him, Wabuji, kind of a famous warrior in the Ojibwe world. I never had a way to talk about this when I was a kid going to school, but as I got older, it did bother me more that I could go to school for 13 years in a row to learn whatever I needed to be successful in the world, and none of it had anything to do with me. It was kind of like the absent narratives were screaming at me. And they were screaming, you and yours aren't important, aren't relevant, don't matter. Because if we were important, relevant, or mattered, somebody would have said something in 13 years of an education. Erasure, colonization. And at the same time, I do believe in education. I went all the way with mine. I see the power that it can deliver. But we shouldn't have to sacrifice so much of ourselves or deny our children the right to know who they are just so they can get a hope that they too could get a slice of sweet American apple pie. There are different ways to do it. And I think, for me, this is what something like Wadukudading can offer in many ways, is a chance to know who you are and learn about the rest of the world. Because you put somebody else in charge of how to orchestrate that, pretty soon you got 1% of the airtime and you're back to the colonial narrative. That's why there's a value to having tribal colleges, so you can do tribal things when you educate tribal people. And lots of other initiatives too. Cornell West, we are not a nation of immigrants. We are a nation with immigrants, with indigenous people, and with enslaved Africans in its origin. What a difference one little word makes. Instead of a nation of, we are a nation with. Usually it's well-intended when someone says that, but of course it immediately marginalizes all the people who were here before America was here and have been here ever since. By the way, you could apply that frame to any fault line in American society. America is also not a Christian nation. It's a nation with Christians, but also with Jews, with Sufis and Muslims and traditional Native Americans, atheists and agnostics, all of whom are just as American as anybody else. It's the effort to say that America is, insert any subsection of the population, will inherently be divisive and marginalizing to somebody. Those are statements of fact, not getting overly political. But some people are trying to infuse that into the politics too. Some pictures of my father. I'm pretty brown, but so surprised with people, sometimes my father's not native at all. He was born in Vienna, Austria. He was an Austrian Jewish immigrant, survivor of the Nazi Holocaust. Spoke only German the first 13 years of his life. And he has an amazing story. So when we get to the questions, feel free to ask a little more. But he made it to America at age 14, lied about his age at age 17, signed up for the US Army. World War II was still going. I think he wanted to kill Nazis. But they sent him to the Pacific Theater, stationed in the Philippines. Whoops. And eventually he made his way to Minnesota, met my mom, and here I am. My mom grew up in a little village called Bena, heart of the Leech Lake Res, population 400. Half of them are my cousins. It's actually not an exaggeration. And they would pull all the kids from school for wild rice harvesting, for fishing, for hunting. All the kids had to help with food production. And she lived her first 18 years entirely on the reservation, born in the Catholic Indian Hospital, lived in Bena, went to Catholic Bena schools. And she only met one professional Native person her entire childhood. There are about 10,000 members at Leech Lake. Out of 10,000 people, they couldn't find one to be a teacher, social worker, banker, police officer, janitor. Those were the systems that we were dealing with. The one professional person she met was the school nurse. She thought, maybe I could do that. So she went to nursing school. After that, one of her first jobs was working for our tribe's health program, and she thought, wow, even here, Native people are getting pushed around. Enough of that. She went back to school and got a law degree, became the first female Native attorney in the state of Minnesota. When I was a kid, she'd bring me with her to court, and she'd say, you just sit there and don't say a word. So, I'd sit there, not say a word. And I couldn't remember court cases that well, but I do remember things. I remember that she was the only woman in court. I remember that she and her law partner, Paul Day, were the only natives in court. And I came walking out of there thinking, you know what? We can do stuff. That's the D in the DEI. Diversity, representation, role models, it matters. And my mom was so dang smart, she could have been anything she wanted to be. She could only imagine herself being the one thing she saw somebody who looked like her doing. We just had the retirement celebration for Paul Day. And I had to tell him, you were the first Native man I ever saw doing something professional. And we were in a room with about 300 people, most of whom were Native judges, lawyers, social workers, and educators. I said, look how far we've come. And think about how much further we still have to go. And who got us there? I hesitate to show economic data on my ancestral village of Bena because it can reinforce one of the stereotypes about Native people, which is that we're all living in squalor on a reservation. I already told you we're not all living on a reservation, right? But we're also not all living in squalor. The economic landscape is complex. Tribes employ 1.1 million people, pay out $49.5 billion in employee compensation every year, 127 billion, that should be net economic output. Be nice to natives, you're going to end up working for one someday. In 1969, 57% of the native population is below the poverty line. In 2020, it was at 23%. It tells you two things. One is 23% of a population below the poverty line. That's gross. That's unacceptable. That's an indictment on America and its oppressions, not Native people and their lack of a work ethic. It also means that we just shaved 34 entire percentage points off of Indigenous poverty. That's not something the US government did for us. That's something Native people did for themselves. If you wanted to learn something about how to bring people out of systemic poverty, ask Indigenous people. They have the strongest track record in the entire United States of America for how to do exactly that. And when you can see that, then it can take you from pity and paternalism, oh, those poor people, I'll lean in when it's comfortable. I got a Jesus complex about it. To, how did you do that? What can I do to help amplify that effort? How can I ally myself to the worthy things that you're doing. In addition to, here's what I've learned and what I know and what I can contribute. It moves you into partnership and out of paternalism. I like this quote by Abigail Echo Hawk. "We are not a historically underserved population. My history is one of ancestors who survived so I could thrive. My history didn't start with Western civilization. I am colonially underserved. I am institutionally underserved, and I am historically resilient."
Oh.
She's cool. So, how y'all doing? I'm just getting started here, so I want to be mindful of the time. I'm going to do a little bit on some language stuff, and then and a little bit on some history stuff. And then we'll just open it up for your questions, and you can steer me, and you can cut me off when I need to quit. All right, so maybe I'll skip that one. Man, I love our language for so many reasons. Every single language on planet Earth encapsulates the unique worldview of a people. I'll maybe just give you an example or two. In our language, the word for an elder, Gaa-pi-izhiwebak, it literally means great being. Our word for an elderly woman, miinawaa, describes one who holds things together, kind of describes the family matriarch. In English, we have words too. Old woman, elderly woman, aged woman, and then all these derogatory words, hag, No wonder nobody wants to admit how old they really are. We're spending a fortune on facelifts and Botox injections, and how many elders go on the cover of Cosmo? I think it's like sexist and ageist. Because the message to women becomes, your value is to be 20 years old, because if you are young and pretty, that's how you get a man. When there's so many other things that a woman can be valued for. And the message to men is, get some money, because that's how you get a young and pretty woman. And if you got a lot of money, doesn't matter how horrible your character is, you can even be president of the United States. And I think that's some pretty horrible messaging for everybody. But embedded in other languages are some very different ways of looking at things. When I was starting, I was mentioning Anishinabe. It's an Ojibwe word that is used both for my great-grandparent and my great-grandchild. Spans 7 generations. So if you think 7 generations ago, our ancestors were thinking about what will they need 7 generations from now? And they thought, we are going to need land, clean water, access to resources, our language and our culture. And they're going to need each other. They're going to need community. When I think 7 generations from now, what are my great-grandchildren going to need? I kind of think they're going to need the same things. And so we got work to do. For all of those things, so many of our policies, be they economic, political, or environmental, we're like mortgaging their well-being for a short-term quarterly, shareholder profit statement. And it's really unfortunate. And we are starting to see the accumulating price of having done that for generations. There are different ways to do things. I left home when I finished high school thinking I'm going to get out of town and never come back. Went to college. I thought I want to go home and never leave. I probably freaked my parents out when I said, I know I have a college degree, but I'm not taking a job. And I'm also not going to graduate school. I'm going to hang out with my elders and walk the earth. They said, well, that's beautiful. Good luck paying for that, because we are done. And that's exactly what I did. Yep. I met Paul shortly after this. I found this guy, the late, great Archie Mosé. He was born in 1901, and he was about 12 years old, I think, maybe the first time he saw a white man. He was in his 30s, first time he saw a car. When I met him, he was in a little modern house watching WWF SmackDown on a TV and laughing really loud. I thought he was going to be sitting there praying for world peace or something, you know. Went to see him, and he shut off the TV. He said, "Oh, I was waiting for you." I said, "What? How could you know who I am?" I was all nervous. But he had a dream about someone. I must have looked like this person in his dream. For him, that was enough. So he said, "Well, sleep on the couch." About 5 a.m, he's standing over the couch. Get up. Get up. You got to drive me to a funeral. Funeral? Oh my God. Oh, okay. So then I kind of became one of his gophers. Go for this, go for that, drive me here, drive me there. Honestly, it was kind of like Forrest Gump once he realized he could run. After that, every time he went somewhere, he was running, and he never thought it would take him anywhere, but it did. I just wanted to be in the room. I was just fascinated by all of it. And I'm super persistent and a little OCD, so I hung in there. And there's more to the story and trajectory, but I'll give you that much of it. There's Betsy, one of his kids. I remember after Archie had passed away, we have a ceremony for bringing the family out of mourning. And Betsy, she's always so sweet. She'd kiss me on each cheek every time I saw her, and she's like the sweetest, grandma persona. But she had the dark glasses and the mean native grandma look too. Usually reserved for her grandkids, and then she'd shake her cane at them and they'd scurry around and do whatever she said. But I was coming over there and I was thinking, I don't know who's going to be talking at this drum ceremony, because Archie had done all of it, And so I went over there, and Betsy says, "Bet you wonder who's going to be talking today." I was like, "Yeah, who's going to do that?" And she said, "Well, you are." I said, "What?" At this point, I'm in my 20s. And she goes, "Well, you've been following my dad around all these years. I'm going to find out what you learned." By the way, he never forgot anybody's native name, and he also never made a mistake or something like that. And she handed me a bunch of tobacco pouches, talked for all these different people. Yeah, so that was my first public speaking event in Ojibwe. I stammered and stuttered my way through that thing and eventually got done. She gave me one nod, and that was that. I was off to the races. We've been trying, and I don't pretend to have all the answers or perfect success at anything. This is some pictures of my daughter, first daughter, through all of these things. But I said, I got to teach her this language. She went with me everywhere I went, and I go to a lot of places. And I remember they gave me a keynote address at one of the first Anishinaabe and Teg conferences in Sault Ste. Marie. And they've been going 30 years now, which means I'm getting old. But she was there running in circles around the podium while I'm talking. Finally, her little voice catches on the mic, "Inky booged," which means "I farted." And that was it. No one could hear anything else I had to say the rest of the day. But they're all talking. Hear that little kid? She's speaking Ojibwe. Something's going on. And she's been there working with, this is Jim Mitchell, one of our elders in Mille Lacs. So she's been working with the transcribing and translating teams, and it's really great seeing what she's able to do in the language too. My grandmother went to residential boarding school, my mom's mom. My dad's family is straight out of Europe. I shouldn't know anything. But we've been restoring the intergenerational transmission of the language and culture in our family. And we're not the only family trying to do that. And we're trying to scale these things up too with a lot of our other efforts. Here's my grandma. Oh yeah, and that's, her name's Luella. And that's my youngest daughter. Her name is Luella too. She's outside right around the corner there running the book stand when we're done. There's our crew, 9 kids. We're in the grandbaby business now too. All right, so you want me to do a little bit on some culture stuff too? You want me to do a little bit more? And then you just tell me when I need to knock it off. So Maybe it'll be easier just to share a story or two. Here's one of my sons. I think in a former time, he simply would have been the most promising young warrior in the village. He's gifted in the woods, like things that are, he is taught, but some things are hard to teach. He could even set rabbit snares when there's no snow on the ground, but you have to know a lot to tell where the rabbits are moving. He could keep his cool in the woods, even as a really young hunter. A lot of times, deer comes out and people are like, oh, deer, bangity, bang, bang, bang. And he'd watch, wait for the deer for his head to go behind a tree. Then he'd raise up, and then he'd watch, take his shot. And then if the deer ran, he'd take off a blaze orange hat and put it on a tree branch to mark where he shot from. And he'd go find his deer or whatever. But so he was pretty remarkable in the woods. He still is. We have a ceremony when someone has their first successful harvest. And when we do this, the ancient custom was we're living in a wigwam village, cook the whole deer, invite the whole village, and you eat it in one fell swoop. For us, we live like everybody else, school, jobs, moving around. So we'll cook up some of the deer and we invite over friends and family and community members and namesakes and so forth. And then there's a feast. And instead of just eating, we kind of ritually feed the successful hunter. Take a spoon of the food. His name is Izhichigewin, lone thunderbird. Izhichigewin. And you'll have to refuse the first bite. No, I'm thinking about children who don't have enough to eat. Oh, okay, so put it back, get another spoonful. Izhichigewin. No, I'm thinking about my elders who can't get out in the woods to hunt for themselves. Okay, put it back. Izhichigewin. No, I'm thinking about my family and my community and the people who came here today to support me. Okay, Izhichigewin. And then he can eat. And then we'll say, well, Izhichigewin, you just changed your life. Because up until today, you were what we call the dependent. You depended on all the people in this room to provide all of your food. But today now, you are providing for all of them. And that is what it means to be an adult. From today on, you'll have a special power. You have it when you go hunting, fishing, gathering. You'll have it when you get a job. And it's just the power to gather resources. So when you gather resources, when you exercise your power, you think about kids who don't have enough. Elders who can't get it for themselves, your family, your community. And then they have to give away the rest of their killed, packaged up venison, so they're impoverished. Now, I have a lot of kids, and I do a lot of experimenting on them. So I have to say this stuff is pretty formative. So flash forward to like age 16, I had a friend complaining, oh, my back, I can't get out in the woods. I haven't had venison in my freezer in so long. He didn't say anything, but he went out in the woods, he harvested a deer, cleaned it up, packaged it up, went to my friend's house, filled up his freezer, and then he left. My friend calls and he's on the verge of tears. And he's like, I didn't even know people remembered that teaching. What an incredible young man. Can I give him some gifts? Well, sure. A couple years later, he's going to go to prom. So I get him hooked up with a tux, and he and his buddy were going to double date to the prom. And then his friend's mom was like, oh, my next check, I'll get you the tux, I promise. And then her car went down. And she said, oh, I'm so sorry, but I can't. And so he's all heartbroken, ready to cancel his prom date. My son goes, oh, forget that, come with me. So they went to the tux place. My son canceled his tux. He took the money. They went to the Goodwill. They bought a couple suits. Everybody went to the prom. I show up to take pictures of my kid, and I'm like, where's that tux I rented for you? Then I got the story, and I said, well, son, if you would have said something, I would have rented that kid a tux. And he looked at me completely baffled. He's like, but Dad, it's my job to look out for people who don't have enough. And so what I learned about some of these cultural practices, sure, they reflect our values as a people. Collaborative, communal, consensus-based, but they also shape our values as a people. And when he was going through one of his namesakes was saying, we also invite all the successful hunters just to share things, whatever you want to share with this young man. And he was saying, you know, there are different kinds of deer in the woods. There are fawns, does, young bucks, big mature antlered bucks. They all act differently too. They move differently. Deer are gentle creatures. They don't really attack people that much. But on the rare times when that happens, sometimes it surprises people to know that of all the deer most likely to charge a human, it's not a big mature antlered buck, but actually an immature buck. And they're also the deer most likely to get shot or even hit by a car. And what he was kind of doing is providing a little metaphor for manhood. And he said, when we're young, as men, that's when we make a lot of our biggest mistakes. That's when we think driving 90 miles an hour is a good idea and get ourselves or somebody else killed. That's when we think, you know, that experimenting with alcohol or drugs is a good idea. It's when we're most likely to go on a date and not respect our partner. So if you want to be a big, mature, antlered buck, you got to act like one. They move a little slower. They think before they act, you know, and he just kind of laid it out. Very powerful, you know, and we have lots of ceremonies. All our boys and girls have gone through these ceremonies as they all love to hunt. And Nano Dabaigas. Okay, I better get started then, you guys. All right. But in any event, it gives you a taste for some of the things within the cultural practice. These are things that, you know, even though I have to say there's no such thing as the culture, you know, this is just kind of what our family does with regard to Ojibwe culture, and there are lots of variations on it. So it's not prescriptive, but it's reflective of what Native people think, believe, and do. And I think there's a great value to keeping those things going. All right. So I'll give you maybe one quick story, and then we'll take a couple questions, and we'll let you move into the next thing here. That's a view of our family property. And, you know, when my folks were getting started, my dad was restarting his life. My mother was trying to find a pathway out of poverty. They had humble beginnings, but they had acquired this piece of property, and it did not look like this. If you turn away from the water, it looked just like this, wide open farm fields. Probably was a virgin pine forest at one point in time. That's my dad on the tractor with my brother there. They planted all those trees. It completely transformed the entire landscape and the ecosystem. It's just a couple people. Of course, they had a child labor force. I think a lot of us look around at this world at all of its problems, be it politics or race relations, or how do we overcome historical injustices or climate change. And it's easy to think, not much I can do about that. Try to be a decent human, tell my kids to be decent humans. I hope it's enough. And it never feels like enough, because all that's necessary for evil to triumph is good people to do nothing or too little. But it's not like we need to take this mountain of problems humans have been making for thousands of years and move that whole mountain right now. It's more like we need to keep planting the seeds, and it can change everything. That's the work. That's what we do when we educate a child. That's what we do when we start a new program, school, initiative. All of these things matter. I watched the Hawaiians. They went from their language being illegal in public schools and only 1,000 speakers left to 24,000 speakers, 3,000 of whom have learned it as their first language in the home. There's some amazing things happening in a lot of different places. And of course, we need a lot more of that. I can see the problems too, but I have a lot of hope. And I have to say, seeing all of you come out and lean in, and all the work that's been happening, I can see the signage going up on the island. I can see the education, arts, and other initiatives that are happening in this area. You know, it counts. It matters. And I think we need to keep going so we don't end up with just a bunch of window dressing, but really substantive change. But every journey starts with first steps. And so I want to thank you for all the steps that you've taken and for your kind time and attention. Thank you so much. Miigwech. All right. Do we have time for a couple questions or?
We have time for 3 questions.
All right,
Uh,
3.
And I want to urge you, you found on your seat these feedback forms. Can you, yeah.
There you go.
Thank you. And we received some wonderful support for this event from the Duluth Superior Area Community Foundation, the Grutzner Madeline Island Fund, and the Anishinaabe Fund. And they have asked us to provide some feedback. Was this a good talk? So please fill out the forms that are on your seat, and there's a place to leave them back there. And then if you'd like to continue the conversation, Marty Curry has reopened the Lucera Street Cafe for the next few minutes. And so anybody who wants to continue the conversation is welcome over there.
Mhm.
Thank you so much. And Matt, sorry.
Hi,
Great.
thank you so much for the talk. I have a quick question about just the broader movement towards Indigenous sovereignty in general across the United States, but in particular, I'm guessing that you've heard or maybe have been involved in the concept of an honor tax. There's something in southern Minnesota. So people who own, the concept is that there was a lawyer in southern Minnesota. She learned through some of her historical research on the farmland that it was land that had been taken during the war with I think the Lower Sioux tribe, I think, in the 1860s. And she contacted the local tribal chairperson and offered to pay a tax on the land that her ancestors had acquired. I'm just wondering if you can speak to that concept and if, you know, what your thoughts are.
I was going to try to
on it.
repeat the question, but I can't.
So,
Okay.
yeah, that's my question.
For the live streamers, maybe you can summarize.
Sure. Yeah, so thank you for a great question. So it's about an honor or voluntary land tax, as a restorative justice measure. So this has been experimented with in some other places, and I support it. I think in many ways, there isn't a perfect template for what healing and reconciliation looks like. We have to experiment and see what works. So some of the big topics under discussion, these days include, reparations, voluntary land tax, land back, are some of the restorative justice measures that have been brought up with Native communities. Something that is distinctive about Native communities that's a little different from other, minoritized groups in America is that Native is not just another racial or ethnic group, it's a distinct political status, and there are entities, tribes that predated the United States, existed through all of America's history and still exist, even though they've been messed with and reconfigured and, under assault and all these different things. So it changes the politics around that. Like if you wanted to do a voluntary land tax to rectify injustices, with Chinese railroad workers, it's harder to do because you'd have to try to partner with a nonprofit, and maybe there are some great ones that are focused on just that. It just gets a little more complex. But if there's, a land-based sovereign Native nation, it provides a vehicle where that, can work. I think what you'll also find, though, is that the economics are different in different places. There's some whole states like South Dakota and Nevada where tribal gaming enterprises don't really make much of a difference because those states already legalized gaming across the state, so tribes don't have monopolies. So the gaming stuff is not like, rising tides lift all boats. So in places that are much more economically disadvantaged, things like that can have a much more outsized impact, as opposed to places where, tribes have more financial muscle and it, doesn't amount to as much. But also, as an emerging effort, it'll be small when you start, but if you keep at it, it can actually be pretty substantial. Yeah. There's another one back here.
Marty, yeah, sorry guys. I'm going to ask the question. Our organization, our tribal organization, has identified almost 600 acres of allotment land on Madeline Island that is currently under private ownership.
Yep.
There is a huge amount of private and generational capital that has sustained families on this island, non-native families.
Yep.
Whose responsibility is it to initiate a restorative justice, to give, and not say give, or repatriate the land back to its rightful owners?
It's a great question. The question is about land back, and specifically with Madeline Island and 600 acres of, tribal lands that are now in non-native hands.
And when I say whose responsibility is it, I'm saying also from a native, non-native perspective, but also, since this is a cultural cornerstone to Ojibwe culture, what other tribes' responsibility is it to initiate those procedures? Yeah.
So the only part that I'm struggling with is initiate, because I honestly feel like everybody should. Because I think who should take the primary responsibility and sort this all out is different from who will and how do you get action done. It is an unfair burden on oppressed peoples that they often have to provide the initiative for their own justice. They shouldn't have to do that. The people who have been the primary beneficiaries of their oppression should initiate that. But the should, you can wish in one hand and, right. So ultimately, throughout history, and this is like right out of Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, there's never been a case of the oppressor just liberating the oppressed. The oppressed have always had to raise the demand for anything to happen, right? Like men should have just got together and said, you know what, this is a bunch of crap, women should vote. But they didn't do that. Women had to bring the issue, they had to fight for it, they had to get beat with police batons. Eventually, it pricked the consciousness of an all-male Senate that voted for women's suffrage. Women should not have had to ask. But if we just said, we'll wait for the men to figure out what they should be doing, we'd still be waiting, right? So to the tribal folk in the community, it doesn't mean that someone else doesn't have responsibility, but we need to take initiative. At the same time, for everybody else, it's not always comfortable to understand and grapple with the fact that every acre of land that was pried out of native hands and given away to someone else or sold cheaply meant generation upon generation of accumulated wealth, resources, and benefits. And it doesn't mean you're a bad person, but it does mean that you got someone else's fruits for generations. And so there is a responsibility to ask, what does justice look like? The answers may be quite varied, and we have to have a collective conversation rather than have me or anybody else say, this is what it must be. But I do think that we need to move towards action. And it's different messages for different people, a lot of times, I think, especially for a lot of white Americans, one of the messages is just be brave, lean in. Discomfort is your friend. Quit skipping leg day in the gym. Go to the gym. It doesn't always feel good. It does not always feel good. But if you keep going to the gym, it starts feeling not quite so bad. And if you acclimate to it, it can actually feel good. And above all, you will become much stronger. Go to the gym, embrace discomfort, have the uncomfortable conversations, think about the things. How much money did Rockefeller leave behind? When he left, all of it. There are a lot of ways to take care of your family and take care of justice too. It's not about taking from someone to give to someone else. It's about thinking about how do we create a more just world for everybody, And There are a lot of things we can do. And I've seen a lot of good things happen. Yeah, and by the way, when your neighbor is more fully humanized, you are too. Like, make no mistake, I'm coming for everything my ancestors were denied. And that shouldn't scare anybody, because it just means I'm coming for longevity. And if I get it, it doesn't reduce anyone else's longevity. I'm coming for humanity, and if I get it, it doesn't reduce anyone else's humanity, it enhances it. If I get equal rights, it doesn't diminish someone else's rights, it enhances theirs. Even if your neighbor's house value goes up, yours does too. Like, we all do better when we all do better.
Does the arrival of landscape preservation or metallic mineral body preservation or the preservation of the quality and quantity of water enter that notion of reparations and or payback and or visioning for the future in this whole discussion?
I think so. I mean, even that little example I shared earlier about Leech Lake and like positive impacts on the environment for all people who, you know, extract resources and use the space. You know, I do think these things are complex, so we need to have thoughtful conversations about all of the things. But I think oftentimes about Red Lake in northwestern Minnesota, which said we will not do allotment. We will not develop this lake. You know, when there was so much pressure on them to allot, to sell, to develop, to exploit and extract resources. And today, they have the cleanest aquifer in the entire state of Minnesota. You know, they have the most abundant walleye fishery in the state of Minnesota. You know, there are great dividends paid when we think 7 generations ahead instead of immediate, you know, financial gains. But it is complex. Our ecosystems are all intertwined. We can't just fix it on one postage stamp and mean that that fixes the whole world. It's helpful, and we necessarily have to do partnerships between private landholders, you know, nonprofit organizations, tribes, state, municipal, federal governments. But when you can mobilize for collective action, some really amazing things can happen. Like, we took my parents' property, you saw a picture of, and put it all under conservation easements, so it'll never be developed or, you know, extracted in any way. Like, I couldn't do anything to it if I wanted to. They're permanent. You know, that's something a private landholder can do. But when you have the private landholders and the tribal stakeholders and the municipal ones all in the same area doing that together, all of a sudden you got thousands of acres, you know, that is much more carefully stewarded. So I think sometimes we're very zoomed in, and sometimes we do need to zoom out and get the big picture view. But yes, of course.
I would like to take this opportunity to introduce Mike Wiggins, the new site director, permanent site director for the Madeline Island Museum. And to thank to thank him for this wonderful setup tonight. And you can thank him by coming back, enjoying this wonderful exhibit if you haven't had the chance to see it before, and keep this great museum going.
And we're only here in this room because of my staff. I have awesome staff: Mike Murtis, Dave Anderson, Daniel Barber, and Lois Carlson. Small but mighty, and so I want
And I would like to thank Mark Lundeen for handling the live streaming. As I said, a new venture for us. Jay Ersling, Paul Demain for making this happen, tracking all the details, and Pixie Martin for handling the grant application and this feedback. Thank you all, and thank you.
All right. Thanks so much, everybody. I'll go into the alcove here where the goodies are, and I'm happy to sign books for anybody who wants them. And then I'll stick around and head over to wherever they straight down there. So I'll be available for schmoozing and visiting a little bit when we're done. Thanks so much. You've been great.
Good job.